Do you remember those forgotten side dishes you could only find in old cookbooks? They turned simple meals into something special at every family table. How did we let those recipes disappear? Cottage cheese Jell-O salad was one of those curious creations that somehow became a potluck staple all across America. It mixed creamy cottage cheese with lemon or lime gelatin, and if that was not bold enough, people often added celery, grated carrots, or pineapple chunks. You would walk into a family reunion or church dinner in the 1940s, and there it was, wobbling in all its glory next to fried chicken or meatloaf. People loved it because it looked presentable, stretched ingredients, and felt like something special during tight grocery budgets. You might not see it on modern tables, but back then, molded salads were more than a trend. They were pure kitchen creativity when you had to make do. This one came straight from old community cookbooks with curled pages and faded ink, the kind passed down through families who knew how to stretch every dollar. Corn pudding casserole was the side dish that made even the humblest dinner plate feel warm and complete. If you flipped through old recipe cards tucked behind flour jars, chances are this one was written in your grandmother's handwriting. It combined sweet corn, butter, eggs, and milk into a creamy bake that sat proudly next to roast ham or pork chops. It was easy, affordable, and filled bellies, making it a go-to for potlucks, church suppers, and holidays. The top baked up golden brown, the inside stayed soft and rich, and every bite reminded you how folks pulled meals together from what they had. Corn pudding casserole carried meals through tough times, earning its place in kitchens from the Depression to the 70s. You do not see it much now, but back then, that creamy baked corn meant comfort on a plate. Celery Victor sounds like a recipe that came from a fancy hotel menu, but this marinated celery dish made its way into regular households thanks to those old cookbook collections in every drawer. It was as simple as boiling celery until tender, chilling it in broth or vinegar, and serving it up with herbs or hard-boiled eggs when you wanted to show off. You could find it at potlucks or holiday tables, dressed up to look fancier than it was. People back then knew how to stretch even the humblest ingredients into something worthy of company. Celery Victor turned plain celery into a crisp, tangy salad that felt like a proper side dish next to roasted meats or casseroles. It showed up in cookbooks throughout the 1930s and 40s, passed along at church suppers and family gatherings. Macaroni and tomatoes was the forgotten side that kept dinner plates full when grocery budgets were stretched thin. You would boil macaroni, toss it with stewed tomatoes, a pat of butter, and maybe onions or cheese if you had extra. It was not glamorous, but it got the job done. You could find this simple pasta side in old community cookbooks from the 40s through the 70s, tucked between casserole recipes and Jell-O molds. Families loved it because it used pantry staples, cost little, and made meals stretch farther. It showed up next to pork chops, meatloaf, or whatever leftovers you had. Macaroni and tomatoes was the quiet hero of the table, filling bellies when money was tight. You do not see it much now, but in its day it was a practical filling side that showed how far folks could go with a box of pasta and a can of tomatoes. Pineapple cheese salad sounds like one of those retro recipes that people talk about with equal parts horror and nostalgia, but this sweet and savory mashup was a potluck star once upon a time. You would mix canned pineapple chunks with shredded cheddar cheese and mayonnaise, sometimes tossing in a maraschino cherry on top to seal the deal. It sounds like a strange combination today, but back in the 1950s and 60s, recipes like this came straight out of the old spiral-bound cookbooks tucked in every kitchen drawer. People loved it for its bright, tangy sweetness and how easy it was to throw together with cheap pantry staples. Pineapple cheese salad showed up at luncheons, holiday tables, and potlucks, holding its own next to roast turkey, ham, or casseroles. It might raise a few eyebrows now, but back then, that quirky little salad was a way to dress up a meal and bring something special to the table without spending a fortune. In its day, this strange, creamy creation meant you came prepared. Mock oyster casserole, also known as eggplant dressing, was one of those clever Depression-era recipes that made its way into old cookbooks and never fully disappeared. The name might raise a few eyebrows now, But the whole point was to create a rich, flavorful casserole that mimicked the texture and heartiness of oyster stuffing without needing expensive seafood. You would take cooked eggplant, breadcrumbs, onions, and herbs, bake it until golden on top, and serve it as a side dish at holiday dinners or Sunday suppers. It filled out the table, stretched garden produce, and made even the simplest meal feel just a little more complete. Back then, you could find recipes like this scribbled in the margins of faded cookbooks or passed along at church potlucks. People knew how to make do with what they had, and this casserole proved that even eggplant could stand in for something fancier. You might not find it on modern menus, but back then, eggplant dressing was a practical, comforting side that made every meal feel just a little more special. Scalloped cabbage bake was the kind of side dish that stretched a head of cabbage farther than you thought possible, and it came straight out of those old community cookbooks where frugal comfort food was king. You would slice the cabbage, soften it in boiling water, then bake it in layers with creamy sauce, breadcrumbs, and sometimes a little cheese if you had extra on hand. It sounds simple, but when it came bubbling out of the oven, golden on top and rich underneath, it turned cabbage into pure comfort food. Families leaned on dishes like this during the Great Depression and World War II, when ingredients were scarce and every meal had to go the distance. Scalloped cabbage bake filled plates at church suppers, potlucks, and Sunday dinners all across America, sitting proudly next to ham, roast chicken, or casseroles. It might not win any beauty contests now, but back then it meant a warm, filling meal made with care. In tough times, even the humblest cabbage could be turned into something worth gathering around the table for. 3 bean molded salad was one of those curious creations from vintage cookbooks that made vegetables and gelatin collide in the strangest way. You would take the classic 3-bean salad, green beans, wax beans, kidney beans, and suspend the whole thing in lemon or lime-flavored gelatin, set it in a mold, and proudly serve it at potlucks or family dinners. Back in the 1950s and 60s, molded salads were a rite of passage in every community cookbook, and this one was no different. It looked fancy, stretched pantry staples, and made sure not a single bean went to waste. People loved it for the bright colors, wobbly texture, and how it sat proudly next to roast meats or casseroles. It might sound a little off-putting now, but back then, molded salads were considered practical and even impressive. This one in particular packed protein, vegetables, and a little retro flair all in one strange, shimmering dish. You might not see it outside of vintage recipe cards today, but once upon a time, it was the talk of every potluck. Buttered parsley potatoes were the kind of humble, forgotten side dish that quietly filled plates and satisfied appetites across America, especially during lean times. You would boil small baby potatoes, toss them in butter, sprinkle with chopped parsley, and serve them up next to roast beef, fried chicken, or whatever you had on the table that night. It was not flashy, but back in the day, that was the whole point. Simple, affordable, filling, and easy to dress up with ingredients straight from your garden or pantry. You would find recipes like this tucked in the pages of faded cookbooks from the 1930s to the 70s, passed along at potlucks and family dinners. Buttered parsley potatoes were proof that you did not need much to make a side dish feel complete. They soaked up gravy, balanced out heavier meals, and stretched your groceries farther when money was tight. These days, they have slipped off most dinner tables, but back then, a bowl of buttery potatoes meant you brought comfort, simplicity, and just a little bit of pride to the meal. Golden Glow carrot salad was one of those bright, zesty side dishes that added color and crunch to dinner tables, especially when meals were built around whatever you could grow or stretch from the pantry. You would take shredded carrots, mix them with lemon-flavored gelatin, and fold in crushed pineapple for sweetness, letting the whole thing set into a glossy, citrusy mold that practically glowed on the plate. It sounds unusual now, but back then, molded salads were a potluck favorite, and this one stood out for its bold color and refreshing bite. Families leaned on recipes like this because it was affordable, easy to throw together, and made even the humblest meals feel a little more special. Golden Glow carrot salad showed up at Sunday suppers, holiday spreads, and backyard picnics, sitting proudly next to roast chicken, casseroles, or fried pork chops. It stretched ingredients, added brightness to heavy plates, and gave meals that cheerful, homemade touch. You hardly see it now, but once upon a time, this glowing salad was a quiet symbol of kitchen creativity and making do with simple, practical ingredients. Cucumber and sour cream slaw was the kind of cool, crisp side dish that showed up quietly at family picnics, luncheons, and Sunday dinners long before store-bought coleslaw took over. It was simple to make, but packed the refreshing punch you wanted next to a hot, heavy meal. Thin cucumber slices were tossed in sour cream, vinegar, dill, and sometimes a little sugar, creating a creamy, tangy salad that balanced fried chicken, pork chops, or pot roast. This was a summertime favorite, straight from those old cookbooks where frugality ruled the kitchen. Folks needed side dishes that stretched ingredients but still made meals feel whole, especially when gardens overflowed with cucumbers. You would find this slaw chilling in glass bowls at potlucks and reunions, cooling everyone off after long days in stuffy kitchens. It is nearly forgotten now, but for decades, this creamy cucumber salad was the quiet hero of summer tables, showing how something simple like a cucumber and sour cream could make a meal feel complete. Rice ring with creamed vegetables was the side you pulled out to impress, even if all you had was rice, peas, and a few carrots. This molded rice dish showed up at luncheons, community suppers, and potlucks from the 1930s to the 60s, proving how fancy rice could look with the right presentation. You cooked seasoned rice, packed it into a bundt or gelatin mold, and once it's set, filled the center with creamy peas, carrots, and maybe mushrooms or green beans if you had them. It was affordable, filling, and looked fancier than it really was. These molded sides were all the rage, straight from vintage cookbooks with curled edges and faded ink. Rice ring with creamed vegetables was a no-nonsense way to stretch pantry staples while making the table look proper. You hardly see it outside old recipe cards now, but back then, it was a thrifty, creative dish that added kitchen pride to any meal. Sweet and sour red cabbage was the tangy side dish that anchored family dinners, potlucks, and Sunday suppers for decades. You would slice red cabbage, simmer it with vinegar, sugar, and maybe bacon or apples for extra richness, and let it cook down until tender and glossy. The result was sweet and sour braised cabbage with a deep color and a bright, tangy bite that balanced heavier meals like roast pork or fried sausage. It came from old-world cooking traditions brought by European immigrants and slipped into American cookbooks by the 1940s. Folks leaned on cabbage to stretch meals when times were tight, but they still wanted hearty, flavorful sides. Sweet and sour red cabbage earned its place at the table by turning basic ingredients into something special. You hardly see it today unless you are flipping through vintage cookbooks or dining in old-school German restaurants, but back then it was a dependable side that made plain meals feel brighter. Hot bacon spinach salad was the hearty side that disappeared when lighter, trendier salads took over, but back then it was a real crowd pleaser. You tossed fresh spinach with onions and poured warm bacon grease and vinegar dressing over the top so everything wilted down into tangy, savory perfection. It sounds decadent because it was, and it balanced out roast meats, casseroles, or whatever you were stretching that night. Recipes like this filled cookbooks from the 1940s to the 60s when families turned humble staples and garden greens into something satisfying. Hot bacon spinach salad was a smart way to use greens before they wilted and bacon grease before it went to waste. You would find it at church suppers, family dinners, or tucked in handwritten recipe cards, quietly filling plates. It faded off most tables today, but back then, this rich, tangy salad was one more trick for turning basics into something worth savoring. Pear salad with cheese and mayo might sound like the punchline to a joke now, but once upon a time it was a Southern classic that filled old cookbooks and family tables with its quirky, sweet, savory charm. You would take canned pear halves, top them with grated cheese, usually sharp cheddar, and add a dollop of mayonnaise right in the center, sometimes finishing it off with a cherry on top. It was a strange little salad, but folks loved how it balanced salty, creamy, and sweet flavors all on one plate. This dish came straight from the pages of vintage community cookbooks, the kind passed around at church gatherings, luncheons, and backyard picnics all across the South. Pear salad earned its spot at the table because it used affordable pantry staples, dressed up the meal, and stretched ingredients when fresh produce was hard to come by. You might not find it at potlucks today, but back then, seeing those glossy pears and shredded cheese meant your hostess brought out her best, even if the combination raised a few eyebrows. It was strange, it was thrifty, and it was pure vintage comfort on a plate. Sour cream noodle bake was the kind of creamy, carb-loaded side dish that quietly filled plates and bellies all across America, especially at mid-century potlucks and family dinners. You would boil up egg noodles, toss them with sour cream, butter, chives, and sometimes a little cheese, then bake the whole thing until warm and bubbling with golden edges. It was pure comfort food, straight from the faded pages of those old spiral-bound cookbooks that promised to stretch your groceries and still bring something hearty to the table. Sour cream noodle bake balanced creamy richness with just enough tang, making it a perfect side for roast chicken, pork chops, or fried meats when times were lean. Families leaned on recipes like this because it was affordable, filling, and easy to whip up with pantry staples, especially when grocery budgets were tight and every meal needed to count. You would find it at church dinners, neighborhood potlucks, or scribbled on index cards tucked in recipe boxes, quietly holding its place as a dependable, cozy side dish. It slipped off most menus today, but back then, it made every plate feel just a little more complete. Stewed zucchini with tomatoes was one of those quiet, dependable side dishes that showed up on dinner tables when garden produce was in full swing and folks needed to stretch meals without spending extra money. You would slice up fresh zucchini, toss it with onions, canned tomatoes, maybe a little garlic or herbs, and simmer it down until soft, saucy, and comforting. It was simple, affordable, and practical, making it a favorite in community cookbooks and handwritten recipe cards from the 1940s through the 70s. Families leaned on dishes like this to use up garden harvests or swap in pantry staples when fresh vegetables were scarce. Stewed zucchini with tomatoes showed up at potlucks, Sunday dinners, and quiet weeknight meals, adding a little color and comfort to whatever main dish you managed to scrape together. It might not have been the star of the table, but it was the kind of side that kept everyone full and satisfied, especially when budgets were tight. You do not see it much outside of vintage recipe collections today, but back then, it was a thrifty, nourishing dish that brought humble ingredients to life. Watergate salad, also known as pistachio delight, was one of those playful pastel green sides that walked the line between dessert and salad, confusing generations of potluck guests along the way. You would mix instant pistachio pudding with whipped topping, marshmallows, canned pineapple, and chopped nuts, fold it all together, and serve it chilled in a big glass bowl that practically screamed retro kitsch. It sounds more like a dessert, but back in the 1970s, this fluffy, sweet salad showed up next to roast ham, turkey, and casseroles at family dinners and holiday gatherings. Watergate salad came straight from the pages of vintage cookbooks, celebrated for how it turned inexpensive pantry staples into a crowd pleaser with hardly any effort. It earned its place at the table by stretching ingredients, adding color, and giving every meal a playful, sugary twist. You might not see it much today outside of retro recipe revivals, but once upon a time, this fluffy green salad meant you brought your best, even if it doubled as dessert. Strange by today's standards, but back then, it was a potluck must-have that turned heads and satisfied sweet tooths. Tomato aspic with celery and olives was one of those curious gelatin-based sides that ruled vintage cookbooks but slipped quietly off dinner tables as times changed. You would take savory tomato juice or seasoned broth, mix it with gelatin, and suspend chopped celery, olives, and sometimes hard-boiled eggs inside, then chill it in a mold until firm. It sounds strange now, but back in the 1950s and 60s, molded salads were a symbol of pride and resourcefulness, showing up at luncheons, holiday dinners, and potlucks all across America. Tomato aspic was considered elegant, even a little fancy, turning pantry staples into a glossy, structured side that balanced out roast meats, fried chicken, or whatever leftovers you had. Families leaned on recipes like this to stretch groceries and bring something unique to the table without spending a fortune. It looked impressive, it used affordable ingredients, and it made even the simplest meal feel dressed up. You might not see tomato aspic much today outside of retro cookbooks or quirky food blogs, but back then, it was proof that creativity and practicality ruled the kitchen, no matter how odd the presentation looked. Baked cheese grits casserole was the kind of rich, creamy side dish that made Southern tables feel whole, showing up at Sunday dinners, holiday spreads, and community potlucks when comfort food was king. You would cook up grits until soft, mix in butter, cheese, eggs, and sometimes a little cream, then bake the whole thing until bubbly with a crisp golden top. It was hearty, affordable, and easy to pull together with pantry staples, making it a go-to for feeding families, friends, and neighbors without breaking the bank. Baked cheese grits casserole came straight from the pages of old cookbooks, the kind tucked in kitchen drawers or passed down through generations in handwritten recipe cards. Families leaned on dishes like this because it stretched ingredients, filled plates, and added that creamy, comforting balance to heavy main courses like ham, fried chicken, or pork chops. You might not find it on modern menus outside the South today, but back then, it was a dependable, beloved side that made even the humblest meal feel complete. It was simple, it was filling, and it was pure comfort, straight from the heart of the kitchen. Potato puff bake was one of those thrifty, comforting sides that turned plain old mashed potatoes into something brand new with hardly any extra effort. Families back then knew how to stretch leftovers, and this recipe proved it. You would take yesterday's mashed potatoes, mix in an egg or two, maybe a little butter or milk, and bake them in small mounds until they puffed up golden brown on the outside but stayed soft and fluffy in the center. Potato puff bake found its way into all those old spiral-bound cookbooks and handwritten recipe cards because it was cheap, filling, and practical. Back in the day, wasting food was not an option, and turning leftovers into something that felt special at dinner was just smart kitchen work. You would serve them next to roast meats, pork chops, or with a little gravy when not much else was on hand. It was simple, it was satisfying, and it made a plain meal stretch farther. You hardly see them now, but back then, potato puffs were a dependable trick that kept families fed and made every meal feel just a little more complete. Chili cheese rice squares were the side dish that packed a little heat and a whole lot of practicality into dinner tables, potlucks, and picnic baskets across the country. You would take cooked rice, shredded cheese, chili powder, maybe some canned chilies or beans, mix it together, press it into a baking dish, and bake it until firm enough to slice into neat little squares. They were easy to pack, easy to serve, and they stretched pantry staples into a filling, flavorful side with a hint of Tex-Mex flair. Recipes like this showed up in community cookbooks from the 1950s through the 70s when families needed dishes that traveled well, fed a crowd, and made every meal feel a little more exciting without breaking the bank. Chili cheese rice squares were a regular at church potlucks, school lunches, or backyard cookouts because they were budget-friendly, simple, and satisfying without needing fancy ingredients. You hardly see them today outside of old recipe cards, but back then, they were the clever, portable side that kept bellies full and meals stress-free. Creamed peas on toast points was one of those simple yet oddly elegant sides that showed up on dinner tables and cafe menus all across America, especially when money was tight. You would simmer soft peas in a creamy, buttery sauce, spoon them over crisp triangles of toasted bread, and serve them with roast meats or as a light lunch all by themselves. This recipe came straight from those old faded cookbooks where frugal, filling meals ruled the kitchen. It proved even basic ingredients like canned peas and day-old bread could turn into something satisfying when you got creative. Back in the 1940s and 50s, meals like this helped families stretch groceries while still feeling polished and proper at the table. Creamed peas on toast points showed up at Sunday suppers, holiday dinners, and even tea time spreads because it was comforting, affordable, and easy to whip together when groceries were running low. It might sound simple now, but back then, this creamy, green-topped toast was a welcome sight. Wilted lettuce salad with vinegar dressing was the forgotten side dish that brought warmth, tang, and a little bacon grease magic to family tables all across the South. You would take fresh lettuce, usually straight from the garden, pour hot bacon drippings mixed with vinegar, sugar, and a pinch of salt over the top, and watch the greens wilt down into tender, flavorful bites. It sounds odd to serve salad that way today, but back then, this was comfort food at its finest. Families leaned on recipes like this to use up garden produce, stretch ingredients, and add a hearty, savory side to meals without spending extra money. Wilted lettuce salad was a regular at potlucks, Sunday suppers, and backyard gatherings, sitting proudly next to fried chicken, biscuits, or whatever main dish folks scraped together. You could dress it up with sliced onions, hard-boiled eggs, or crumbled bacon when you had extra to spare. Applesauce Jell-O salad was one of those quirky, retro sides that only made sense when you were flipping through the faded pages of mid-century cookbooks. But for years, this was a potluck classic everyone recognized. You would mix sweet applesauce with cinnamon-flavored gelatin, let it chill until firm, and slice it into glossy, bright red servings that wobbled onto dinner plates. Some folks added chopped nuts or whipped topping, but at its core, this recipe was simple, affordable, and stretched pantry staples into a playful sweet side. Applesauce Jell-O salad showed up everywhere from church suppers to backyard picnics, offering a cool, tangy balance to heavy meals like meatloaf, pork chops, or casseroles. It made you smile, even if it raised an eyebrow. Families loved how easy it was to throw together using ingredients they already had, turning a plain dinner into something a little more colorful. You hardly see it now. But back then, that shiny red salad was proof that even the simplest ingredients could brighten up the table and bring comfort to mealtime. Hominy casserole bake was one of those hearty, dependable sides that quietly held Southern kitchens together, especially when every meal had to count. You would take cooked hominy, mix it with shredded cheese, a little cream, top it with breadcrumbs, and bake it until bubbling and golden. It was simple, filling, and made sure nothing went to waste. Hominy casserole bake showed up at church suppers, family reunions, and holidays, especially in rural areas where pantry staples had to stretch. It might sound old-fashioned now, but this cheesy casserole was pure comfort on a plate, adding a little richness to meals built around fried meats, barbecue, or stews. You would find it in vintage cookbooks, passed down from neighbors or scribbled on recipe cards with curled edges. It has mostly slipped off dinner tables today, but back then, it turned humble ingredients into something worth gathering around. Families leaned on simple dishes like this to bring warmth to the table without spending much. It filled bellies and brought people together, reminding everyone how far frugal, clever cooking could go. Cornflake-topped vegetable medley was the crunchy, thrifty side dish that showed up at potlucks and family dinners, straight from those old spiral-bound cookbooks. You would take canned or frozen vegetables, stir them with cream sauce, pour it into a casserole dish, and finish it with a layer of crushed cornflakes before baking. It sounds unusual now, but back then, this topping was genius. It added crunch, stretched ingredients, and turned plain vegetables into something hearty. Cornflake-topped vegetable medley earned its spot at the table because it made basic produce feel dressed up enough for guests or holidays. It sat proudly next to meatloaf, roast turkey, or ham, offering crispy contrast to heavier mains. Families loved it for how easy it was to throw together, how well it traveled to potlucks, and how much kids liked the crunchy topping. You hardly see it now, but back then, that golden cornflake crust meant you brought your best, even when groceries were tight. It proved simple ingredients could still make a meal feel special and complete. Peach cottage cheese ring was the light, fruity side that felt fancy enough for luncheons and church gatherings, but came from pure thriftiness. You would mix cottage cheese with gelatin, chill it in a mold, and serve it sliced with canned peach halves nestled in the center. It looked polished, used pantry staples, and added sweetness to a plain meal. Recipes like this popped up everywhere from community fundraisers to backyard picnics, adding color and a little protein to the table when produce was scarce. Peach cottage cheese ring balanced between salad and dessert, offering a cool, refreshing break from heavier dishes like fried chicken, meatloaf, or casseroles. Families leaned on molded salads like this to stretch groceries and make meals feel complete. It might sound quirky now, but back then, seeing that glossy, fruit-topped ring on the table meant your hostess brought care to the meal, no matter the grocery budget. It was simple, thrifty, and filled with quiet kitchen pride from a time when every dish had to count. Green bean and mushroom casserole without the soup was the forgotten, homemade version of a side dish families leaned on before canned shortcuts took over. You would cook fresh green beans, sauté mushrooms with butter and onions, stir in cream sauce from scratch, and bake it all with crisp breadcrumbs or fried onions. It was hearty, practical, and made with real ingredients long before condensed soups became a shortcut. This casserole showed up at Sunday dinners, holidays, and potlucks, sitting next to roast meats or ham, adding creamy, comforting balance to every bite. Families loved it for stretching produce, filling plates, and making even basic meals feel special. The homemade version faded when convenience cooking took over, but back then it was pure comfort with none of the shortcuts. You hardly see it now unless you are flipping through vintage cookbooks or swapping recipes with your grandmother, but once upon a time, this casserole was proof that simple, honest food could steal the show. Baked apples with raisins and cinnamon was the spiced, sweet side dish that brought cozy comfort to dinner tables, especially when ingredients were scarce. You would core apples, fill them with raisins, brown sugar, and cinnamon, and bake them until bubbling with syrupy goodness. It was simple, affordable, and made with pantry staples that stretched meals and added sweetness to the table. Baked apples showed up at Sunday suppers, holidays, and weeknight meals, pairing perfectly with roast pork, fried chicken, or even standing alone as a humble dessert. Recipes like this came straight from vintage cookbooks, passed down by generations who knew how to stretch groceries and make the most of what they had. You hardly see them now, but back then, those warm cinnamon apples filled kitchens with that sweet, spiced aroma that made even the hardest days feel softer. They were simple comfort straight from the oven, reminding families how far a little resourcefulness could go. Soft-boiled egg with buttered soldiers was the breakfast shortcut every British-American household swore by when time was tight, but comfort still mattered. You would soft-boil an egg, slice toast into thin strips called soldiers, and dip them right into the runny yolk. Breakfast done in under 10 minutes, warm, filling, and good enough to start even the busiest day. It was simple, practical, and everywhere in old cookbooks that cared more about frugality than fancy plating. Families leaned on meals like this when groceries ran low, but everyone still needed something protein-packed and fast. Kids loved it for the dipping, parents loved it for the speed, and it quietly filled countless tables from the 1930s through the 70s. Somewhere along the way, soft-boiled eggs and buttered soldiers disappeared under frozen waffles and drive-through breakfasts. But back then, it was one of those small, satisfying meals that made mornings a little easier. Now this one might raise some eyebrows. Barbecue raccoon? Yes, you heard that right. While it might seem unconventional, raccoon meat has been a dietary staple in certain regions for centuries. Barbecue raccoon might sound like something out of a wild adventure, but it was once a popular choice in rural barbecues. Raccoon, often considered a pest in urban areas, is actually a lean and flavorful game meat. It's packed with protein and low in fat, making it a healthy option when prepared correctly. In rural areas, where raccoon populations are more abundant, hunting and consuming this meat has been a tradition passed down through generations. The preparation of barbecue raccoon involves marinating the meat and then grilling it to achieve a smoky, savory flavor. It's important to clean the meat properly before cooking it up, or else you're in for some serious food poisoning. While raccoon might not be a common choice for modern barbecue, it's a reminder of how barbecue traditions have always been influenced by local resources and regional tastes. Canned chili over saltines was the kind of quick meal that got dinner on the table fast with hardly any effort, especially when the cupboards were running bare. You opened a can of chili, heated it on the stove, and spooned it over a pile of saltine crackers. That was all there was to it. It might sound plain now, but back when budgets were tight and groceries were stretched thin, this quick, salty, filling meal showed up on plenty of kitchen tables. The saltines soaked up the chili, adding crunch and making a small amount of food go a whole lot farther. Some folks dressed it up with shredded cheese or onions if they had them, but most kept it simple and practical. You would find this recipe clipped from old magazines, scribbled in community cookbooks, or passed along by word of mouth from one busy family to the next. It was never about being fancy. It was about keeping everyone full with what little you had. Today, it is one of those forgotten meals. But for plenty of homes back then, canned chili over saltines made dinner happen fast. Leftover rice with creamed spinach was one of those pantry meals that turned odds and ends into something filling, warm, and fast. You scooped leftover rice into a skillet, stirred in canned creamed spinach, and added a splash of milk or cheese if you had any left. Everything cooked together until hot, and that was dinner. It was creamy, salty, and just filling enough to count when there was not much else in the cupboard. These little skillet meals showed up in old cookbooks because they stretched groceries, made dinner happen fast, and kept families full during lean times. You could eat it plain, add black pepper, or even crack an egg on top if you wanted to feel fancy, but most folks just scooped it onto a plate and called it a night. This meal did not take much: leftovers, canned greens, and a little creativity, and somehow it got everyone fed. Funny how these quick, practical dinners stick with you long after times get easier. Tomato gravy and biscuits sounds unusual today, but in the rural South, it was once a go-to breakfast for those with more tomatoes than money. Canned or fresh tomatoes were simmered with flour, fat, and milk to create a creamy, tangy sauce that was poured generously over hot biscuits. If you had bacon grease, you used it. If not, butter or lard worked fine. The gravy was thick, pinkish, and full of flavor, a bright, hearty start to the day when sausage or eggs were out of reach. Some people added sugar. Others kept it sharp and savory. It was born from necessity but stayed because it was delicious. Old cookbooks passed the recipe down with pride, often scribbled in pencil with side notes like, "Add more pepper if Papa's home." For many families, tomato gravy and biscuits were not just a meal. They were the taste of early mornings on a porch swing, of hot kitchens and clattering pans. It filled you up and left just enough for leftovers at lunch. And while it has nearly disappeared from modern menus, those who remember it know, few things stick to your ribs, or your memory, like tomato gravy made from scratch. If you've ever been to a large gathering or a festive celebration, you might have encountered the grand spectacle of a whole barbecued hog, or ask your grandparents about it. They must know about this epic meal. This classic Southern barbecue tradition was especially celebrated in North Carolina, where it originated. The cooking method involved slow roasting a whole pig over an open flame or in a pit, often for up to 24 hours. Now, we're talking epic proportions. This was the ultimate show of hospitality. Neighbors, friends, and family would gather for hours, feasting on the smoked animal. It was not just a dinner party, but a whole bonding experience. But as life got busier and people moved away from extended family gatherings, the whole hog barbecue started to become less common. Jelly roll-ups on white bread were a quick, sweet little snack that kept plenty of kids going when there was not much else to pack in their lunchbox. You took a slice of sandwich bread, rolled it flat with a rolling pin or a glass, spread on jelly, and rolled it up tight. That was all there was to it. It sounds simple now, but back then, this was the kind of treat that showed up when families had to stretch every dollar. It was fast, easy, and made use of pantry staples that were always on hand. You would find these roll-ups tucked into school lunches, brought to church picnics, or passed around as after-school snacks when groceries were running low. The jelly added sweetness, the bread kept it filling, and it all came together in just a few minutes. It might be forgotten today, but for plenty of families, these jelly roll-ups were a quick fix that kept kids happy and parents sane. Apple ring pancakes were straight out of those old Betty Crocker cookbooks and Sunday church potlucks that every neighborhood seemed to have. You would slice an apple into thick rings, dip them in pancake batter, and fry them up on the griddle. The result was a warm, fluffy pancake wrapped around sweet fruit, all ready in under 10 minutes. Kids loved them because it felt like dessert for breakfast, and parents loved them because they used what was already in the fridge. Apples were easy to keep on hand. Batter came together fast, and the whole thing cost next to nothing. Some folks dusted them with powdered sugar, others kept it plain, but either way, it was a breakfast that disappeared fast. These showed up everywhere, from rural farmhouses to suburban kitchens, quietly filling plates long before frozen waffles and toaster pastries took over. It is one of those breakfasts you do not hear about anymore. But back then, it was a reliable way to start the day. Spam and egg scramble was one of those 10-minute dinners that showed up again and again when times got lean. You diced up a can of Spam, fried it in a hot skillet until the edges curled and crisped, then scrambled in a few eggs with onions if they were around. It all came together fast, filled your plate, and made sure nobody went to bed hungry. Spam was a pantry staple for a reason. Cheap, shelf-stable, and surprisingly versatile. The old cookbooks were full of ways to stretch it into something that felt like a real meal. Toss in eggs, and suddenly, dinner looked good enough to serve without apology. It was salty, hearty, and loaded with that familiar taste of making do with what you had. Families leaned on quick meals like this because they worked. 10 minutes on the stove, a hot plate in front of everyone, and dinner was done. No one claimed it was fancy, but when your pantry was empty and the paycheck still days away, it tasted like a small victory. Funny how those simple, practical meals stuck with us. They filled the gaps and filled us up. Mock apple pie was a trick of the tongue, a sleight of hand in the world of wartime baking. When real apples were too expensive or out of season, home bakers turned to something else entirely: crackers. Saltines, crushed and soaked in a syrup made from sugar, lemon juice, and cream of tartar, formed the filling. With the right spices, mostly cinnamon and nutmeg, it smelled like pie. It even tasted like pie. And unless you were told, you might never guess that the apples inside were just softened, sweetened crackers. This recipe became a quiet star in old cookbooks during the Great Depression and World War II. When rationing made creativity essential, it was about resourcefulness, not deception. Families needed dessert, just intention, and a little bit of cinnamon. For those who grew up on it, the first bite still brings back the magic of making do and making joy from nothing. Let's talk about a meat that's making a comeback, but was once considered a novelty: buffalo. Back in the day, smoked buffalo was a rare treat. It was tough, gamey, and had a strong flavor that wasn't for everyone. But as people started to appreciate more adventurous flavors, buffalo made a comeback. While it's still not as popular as beef or pork, it's definitely gaining ground. It was a popular choice for those who wanted to try something a little different and show off their culinary prowess. They're still rare to find, but if you ever come across smoked buffalo on a menu, it's definitely worth giving it a try for a taste of barbecue history. Mayonnaise and pineapple salad might sound odd now, but back in Grandma's day, it was one of those quirky little recipes that everyone knew how to throw together in minutes. You grabbed a can of pineapple slices, plopped them on a plate, added a dollop of mayonnaise, and sprinkled on shredded cheddar if you had it. It was sweet, tangy, creamy, and surprisingly satisfying. Some folks added a cherry on top to dress it up, but most kept it plain and practical. You would see this salad at potlucks, church socials, or as a quick side dish on busy weeknights when dinner needed help stretching. It was fast, used ingredients people always had around, and filled that gap between sweet and savory in a way that only vintage recipes could. Today, people might wrinkle their noses at the thought, but back then, it was a 10-minute solution to hungry families and empty cupboards. Another forgotten gem from the cookbook that kept so many homes running. Egg in a hole was the breakfast trick every old cookbook seemed to know. Simple enough to pull off in under 10 minutes, but special enough to feel fun. You would cut a hole in the center of a slice of bread, toss it in a buttered skillet, and crack an egg right into the gap. Toasted bread, fried egg, breakfast done, fast and filling with barely any cleanup. It showed up in kitchens from the 1930s through the 70s, always tucked between other quick, comforting recipes. Some folks called it toad in the hole, others sunshine toast, but it was always the same idea: a no-fuss breakfast for busy mornings. It used cheap ingredients most families already had and turned them into something that actually made the morning feel bearable. Kids loved it for the novelty, parents loved it for the speed, and nobody complained when breakfast showed up looking fun for once. It is one of those meals that quietly kept mornings moving, long before breakfast sandwiches and drive-through lines took over. Canned chicken hash was how you made a hot, filling dinner happen when all you had was pantry scraps and a few minutes to spare. You popped open a can of shredded chicken, fried it in a skillet with some chopped onions, and tossed in leftover mashed potatoes or canned potatoes if you had them. Everything crisped up around the edges, browned in the pan, and came together into something that looked decent and filled your stomach fast. Old cookbooks leaned hard on meals like this because they were cheap, quick, and made sure nothing went to waste. Chicken hash might not sound glamorous, but in homes where leftovers were gold, it was a lifesaver. You could top it with a fried egg or spoon a little gravy over it if you were lucky, but most folks ate it just as it was, hot, salty, and good enough to count. This was dinner that made the best of what you had, and back in those days, that meant everything. Funny how meals like this stuck around even when fancier options showed up. Sometimes the fast, familiar ones were the best. Cornmeal mush was breakfast, lunch, and sometimes dinner, depending on how tight things were. Made from water, salt, and cornmeal stirred into a thick porridge, it was one of the oldest and most adaptable poor man meals. While hot, it was ladled into bowls and eaten with a little milk, molasses, or bacon drippings if you were lucky. Once cooled, it firmed into a solid loaf that could be sliced and fried in a skillet until golden brown. Fried cornmeal mush developed a crispy edge and a creamy center, making it a favorite among those who knew how to stretch a pantry. It was incredibly cheap to make. A single sack of cornmeal could feed a family for weeks. You would find it in southern homes, Midwest farms, and mountain cabins, anywhere a hot, filling meal was needed without spending more than a few cents. Some paired it with beans, others topped it with syrup. It might not be on today's breakfast menus, but in those handwritten cookbooks, it remains a quiet legend, proof that even the simplest grains could carry a family through. All right, let's talk about a barbecue ingredient that's more often found in the pot than on the plate: smoked turkey necks. Now, these aren't exactly barbecue stars, but they do deserve a mention. Smoked turkey necks were once a popular ingredient in soups and stews, adding a rich, smoky depth to dishes that made them savory. The process of smoking turkey necks involved slow cooking them over a wood fire, which infused the meat with a smoky flavor while keeping it tender and juicy. Although they might not be the star of modern barbecue menus, smoked turkey necks still hold a special place in the hearts of those who appreciate their unique flavor and versatility. Rice and raisin pudding on the stove was a 10-minute dessert that turned humble leftovers into something sweet, filling, and comforting when times were tough. You scooped leftover rice into a pot, poured in milk, added sugar, tossed in some raisins, and stirred it all together over low heat. That was it. In minutes, the mixture thickened into a creamy, sweet pudding that could stretch a small amount of rice into a treat for the whole family. It sounds simple now, but back then, every leftover counted, and recipes like this helped families avoid wasting a single grain. You would find rice and raisin pudding scribbled onto recipe cards, tucked into community cookbooks, or passed down by word of mouth through generations. It was a clever way to stretch ingredients, keep kids happy, and turn plain staples into something that felt like dessert. Most folks kept it basic, but sometimes a sprinkle of cinnamon or a dash of vanilla would show up if the pantry allowed. It might be forgotten today, but for plenty of families, this quick stovetop dessert was a saving grace when groceries ran low and everyone needed a little sweetness. Peanut butter and honey milkshakes were the quick breakfast booster you would find in every 1960s teen handbook or homemaker guide promising energy in minutes. You would toss peanut butter, milk, and honey into a blender, give it a good mix, and breakfast was done before you could even finish your coffee. It sounds simple now, but back then it was practical, filling, and surprisingly satisfying. Parents loved it because it was affordable and kept teenagers full, and teenagers loved it because it tasted like dessert for breakfast. Some folks added ice or fruit if they had extra, but the basic recipe stayed the same. Peanut butter for protein, honey for sweetness, and milk to bring it all together. It showed up in old cookbooks, school lunch suggestions, and quick breakfast guides long before protein shakes and energy drinks filled grocery aisles. Somewhere along the way, it disappeared under the weight of modern trends, but back then, it was the kind of breakfast that quietly got families through rushed mornings with nothing but pantry staples and a blender. Quick tomato egg drop soup was a fast, practical dinner that showed up in old cookbooks for families juggling tight grocery budgets and tighter schedules. You started with hot broth, usually whatever bouillon cube or soup base you had in the cupboard. Then you poured in canned tomatoes and stirred everything together until it simmered. The final touch was whisked eggs, slowly dripped in as you stirred, turning into silky ribbons in the hot broth. It looked a little fancier than it was, but this meal was all about speed and making the best of what you had. The tomatoes added sweetness, the broth made it filling, and the eggs gave enough protein to keep everyone going. It came together in less than 10 minutes and cost next to nothing, which is exactly why old cookbooks loved it. It was warm, fast, and comforting without much effort. Families leaned on meals like this because they filled bellies and stretched paychecks at the same time. Funny how those quick little soup tricks turned into classics that still stick with people. Potato candy sounds like a contradiction, but for generations, it was one of the cheapest, sweetest treats you could make at home. It began with a single leftover mashed potato, just one. To that, home cooks added powdered sugar, a little at a time, until it turned into a stiff dough. That dough was rolled flat, spread with peanut butter, and then tightly rolled again like a jelly roll. Sliced into pinwheels, the result was rich, creamy, and almost fudge-like. No one could believe it started with a potato. It required no baking, no eggs, and no fancy ingredients, just sugar, peanut butter, and leftovers. In hard times, potato candy appeared at holiday tables, on Sunday dessert plates, and inside tin lunchboxes. It was especially popular in Appalachian kitchens, where thrift and creativity walked hand in hand. It looked like something you would find in a candy shop, but it came from the humblest of ingredients. Kids loved the sweetness, adults loved the nostalgia, and everyone loved that it cost next to nothing. Potato candy was not just dessert. It was proof that when sugar was scarce and spirits low, you could still roll up something sweet. Okay, we're back to pork, but in a whole new way. Pork cracklins. These delicious morsels were made by frying the skin and fat of the pig until they were golden brown and crispy. In America, cracklins were often enjoyed as a snack or served as a topping for various dishes. Now, these haven't completely fallen off the radar, so if you still want to try them, I guess it's time to book a flight. In the Philippines, pork cracklins are known as chicharron, and they're a popular snack and ingredient in many traditional dishes. Chicharron is often enjoyed with a tangy vinegar dipping sauce or used to add crunch and flavor to stews and soups. Cold spaghetti with Italian dressing was one of those forgotten leftover tricks that stretched a single meal into something new without much time or money spent. You would take last night's spaghetti, rinse it off if needed, toss it in a splash of bottled Italian dressing, and that was dinner or lunch, ready in under 10 minutes. It sounds plain, but back then, this was an easy, thrifty way to keep food from going to waste and keep everyone fed. Families leaned on recipes like this when grocery lists ran short and leftovers became the next meal. The dressing added tang, the pasta filled you up, and it all came together cold, quick, and satisfying. You would find cold spaghetti with Italian dressing scribbled in community cookbooks, passed along at potlucks, or quietly traded between neighbors looking for affordable meal ideas. Some folks tossed in vegetables or cheese if they had any left, but most kept it simple and practical. It might feel forgotten now, but back then this cold pasta salad was a staple for families trying to stretch their meals, save their money, and still have something satisfying on the table without turning on the stove. Here's a dish that might surprise you: barbecued pork kidney. This unusual barbecue item was once a favorite among adventurous eaters who weren't afraid to explore every part of the pig. Pork kidneys, with their distinct flavor and texture, were often marinated and grilled to create a unique barbecue experience. Barbecuing pork kidney requires careful preparation and seasoning to balance its strong flavor. Pork kidney is a highly underrated cut of meat, but it is definitely an acquired taste. It used to be more common at barbecue gatherings, but it's become a rarity. It's still popular in some parts of the world. It's a popular dish in some Latin American cuisines, particularly in Argentina and Brazil, known as riñones a la parrilla. In Argentina, this dish is a nod to the country's love for offal and their grilling tradition. It's typically enjoyed with a side of chimichurri sauce. Raisin bran with warm milk and butter was the winter breakfast trick every frugal family knew when mornings were freezing, but there was still work to be done. You would pour bran flakes into a bowl, warm some milk on the stove, add a small scoop of butter, and pour it all over the cereal. Breakfast done in 10 minutes, flat, warm, creamy, and filling enough to carry you through the morning. Families leaned on meals like this when groceries ran tight, but everyone still needed something hot and practical to start the day. It was sweet from the raisins, buttery from the milk, and surprisingly comforting for something so simple. You could find versions of this breakfast in old community cookbooks, homemaker guides, and those faded recipe cards tucked in kitchen drawers. Some folks sprinkled sugar, others added cinnamon, but it always came back to the same quiet goal. Stretch a little food as far as you could and start the day with something warm. Funny how those simple breakfasts disappear when new trends roll in. Salmon and canned pea toasts were how you made pantry food look halfway fancy when the clock and your energy ran out. You took canned salmon, mashed it with mayonnaise, stirred in some peas, and spread it thick over hot toast. That was dinner. It sounds simple now, but when fresh meat was scarce or paychecks were tight, this was the kind of meal that kept families going. The old cookbooks were filled with little tricks like this, ways to stretch canned goods into something that almost felt special. Salmon from a can never fooled anyone, but the crunch of toast and the soft peas made it oddly satisfying. You might even see a sprinkle of pepper or a squeeze of lemon if someone was feeling bold. It came together fast, filled you up, and for those 10 minutes in the kitchen, it made you feel like you still had control over dinner. Sometimes that is all anyone needed. Egg drop soup in farmhouse kitchens was nothing like the kind served in takeout boxes today. It started with homemade broth, often from chicken bones or vegetable scraps, and was gently simmered until fragrant. Then came the eggs. Fresh from the backyard coop, they were beaten and slowly poured into the hot broth, stirring as you poured to create thin ribbons of cooked egg. Some added a handful of chopped herbs. Others threw in leftover vegetables or a scoop of rice. But even in its plainest form, this soup was soothing, warming, and incredibly cheap. It required only 2 ingredients and could be made in under 10 minutes. It was often scribbled in the back pages of old recipe books. No measurements needed, just a note that read, broth, egg, stir slow. And in those 3 steps lived a kind of comfort that has quietly survived generations. Even now, it still tastes like home, like healing, like doing a lot with very little. Let's talk about a meat that's making a comeback, but was once considered a novelty: buffalo. Back in the day, smoked buffalo was a rare treat. It was tough, gamey, and had a strong flavor that wasn't for everyone. But as people started to appreciate more adventurous flavors, buffalo made a comeback. While it's still not as popular as beef or pork, it's definitely gaining ground. It was a popular choice for those who wanted to try something a little different and show off their culinary prowess. They're still rare to find, but if you ever come across smoked buffalo on a menu, it's definitely worth giving it a try for a taste of barbecue history. Egg in a whole toast was one of those fast, comforting breakfasts that managed to make plain old bread and eggs feel like something special in under 10 minutes. You would grab a slice of sandwich bread, cut a circle right out of the center, toss it into a hot skillet with a little butter, and crack an egg into the hole. That was all it took. The bread toasted up golden, the egg cooked right inside, And suddenly, breakfast was on the table without much work or money spent. Families leaned on meals like this when mornings were hectic, paychecks were stretched thin, and everyone still needed a hot meal before heading out the door. It was a staple for school days, early church mornings, or whenever groceries were low but hunger was high. Some folks added cheese or herbs if they had them, but most kept it simple and practical. You would find egg in a hole scribbled on recipe cards tucked into faded cookbooks or passed down by word of mouth through generations. It might feel forgotten today, but back then, this quick breakfast trick kept countless families full, happy, and ready to face the day with just bread, eggs, and a hot skillet. Tell us your favorite forgotten side, hit like, and subscribe so these old cookbook treasures never fade away.